chat that they saw an advertisement for someone who could create your Zoom background. There's a whole new field of setting it up.
That's cool.
Who knew? Okay.
Oh, there's another person.
Did Lex just show up? Oh, hi, Betsy.
I'm just going to be doing some
Betsy's going to be doing tech support in the background.
Oh, cool. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. I'm about to make myself invisible, but it's nice to meet you and say hi.
Yeah.
Looking forward.
Yeah.
Awesome. And I'm just going to put this into my notes so I have the video for embedding. Someone asked about recording. And thank you for the reminder. Those of you who've been on here before might remember that I have some weird block against remembering to hit record. I'm not recording today because we are live streaming, and so then we can use the live stream to put it on our site afterwards. So that's how we get around that piece. But I think maybe we will get started. I'm really delighted to see people are still joining us, but the people will come in. As you come in, feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, but we will begin. So welcome everybody to the Quarantine Book Club hosted by the Jewish Women's Archive and jewishLIVE. I'm Judith Rosenbaum. I'm the CEO of JWA, and I am so glad to be with all of you tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. As I said before, please introduce yourself in the chat box. We love to see who's here with us. Also, please ask questions. As we have our conversation, please ask your questions in the chat box too, and I will share them in the second half of our program.
Awesome.
I am so excited to be here tonight with Natasha Díaz, the author of Color Me In, which is a great book, which I have right here and I really enjoyed. Natasha is a writer and a producer. As a screenwriter, she was a quarterfinalist in the Austin Film Festival and a finalist for both the NALIP Diverse Women in Media Fellowship and the Sundance Episodic Story Lab. Her personal essays have been published in The Establishment and the Huffington Post. Color Me In is her debut novel. It's a young adult novel. We'll talk maybe a little bit about that YA category. And Natasha joins us from New York. She is a born and bred New Yorker. Welcome, Natasha. So excited that you're here with us tonight.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I'm so excited to be here.
So maybe let's just start with how you came to write this book.
Yeah, so I had always wanted to sort of write the book I never had growing up that was about a biracial, multiracial young girl who's Jewish and who's white presenting and who's trying to figure out where she fits and how to be her whole authentic self while still sort of acknowledging the privileges that she has despite how internally sort of broken up she is. And I never really felt like I saw myself on the page growing up or really even as an adult until The Vanishing Half, which just came out like a month ago.
I just read that.
It is right by my bed, and whenever I have a moment to sit down, I read the first 10 pages and I was like, oh, this is amazing. But so anyway, so I really wanted to write this book, but I had a lot of imposter syndrome, and I was really trained. My writing training is mostly in screenwriting and playwriting, and so writing a manuscript was really daunting to me, and I didn't feel like I could do it. And so when I started really focusing on writing as a career, I got literary representation through scripts, and I actually pitched this book as a movie to my managers, and they both represent writers who do both screenwriting and who are authors, but one of them was like, I don't know if you want to write this as a book, but I think it would be a great book. And I was like, of course I want to write it as a book, but I can't. And he was like, why? And I was like, I don't know how or whatever. And he was like, just try it. And what I really realized was I had already written a lot of it in other things, and just in some of the poetry that's in it had already been written. And so once I got into it, once I got past my insecurities, which I guess I didn't ever really fully get past them, but once I got more confident in how I was going to tell it, it came out. So that was great.
Well, I'm so glad that you wrote it and that you took on the imposter syndrome, which so many of us struggle with. It's really important to, I think when we're holding someone's book in your hand, at least I feel so. When I'm holding someone's book in my hand, it's hard for me to imagine that they didn't think they could do it, because it's like, here it is, it's real.
Yeah.
So thank you for naming that, because it's really important for people to understand the process that writers go through. I think once we have the book in our hands, sometimes we forget all of the challenges that the internal and external challenges that go on before it gets to that stage. And I do hope it will be made into a movie. It would make a great movie too, actually.
Hey, from your lips to God's ears.
Yeah. So do you want to read a little piece for us just to kind of set the stage?
Sure. Yeah. So I won't give too much away, because I know there's a good amount of people here and I don't know who's read and who's not, but this is the first chapter of the book. There is a prologue, a moment that Nevaeh, the main character, has with her mother that we could maybe talk about at some point. I feel like it's a good conversation point. But so this is really the first chapter of the book to give you a sense of where she is sort of starting out in this new part of her life, living in Harlem, New York, with her mom after growing up in the suburbs with her father and her mother, and they've now separated. I have lived trapped in that moment ever since, in the dreaded ambiguity that follows me everywhere I go, even here in this grimy mirror and bitter fluorescent glow. The electric hiss, like bees caught in a plastic casing, sends shockwaves from the sterile light bulbs in the bathroom of Mount Olivine Baptist Church. The sound travels over the damp off-white tiles back to my reflection in a mirror, so streaked and blurred with soap scum, my skin almost blends into the walls behind me. If it weren't for the burst of brown freckles that swarm around my nose and across my cheekbones, I'd be the way I am most of the time, invisible, swallowed up whole by the imaginary bugs and the all-encompassing beige. Cloudy Pepto-Bismol pink gel squirts onto me like projectile vomit from the rusted soap dispenser and sends a foamy streak across my light yellow shirt. I go to grab a handful of waxy paper towels piled up on the side of the sink and bump my phone and church program, which I've covered with poetry scribbles, sending them to the ground. Damn it! My shout echoes from the empty space, and I stand with my eyes pinched shut, ready for Jesus Christ to float into the ladies' room and smite me for using foul language in his house. But no one comes. The organ upstairs begins to play, accompanied by the choir. They drag these hymns out for like 20 minutes. 4 sentences that repeat over and over and over, gaining in volume and excitement and conviction with each go around. Take me to the water, take me to the water, take me to the water, there to be baptized. This is the song before closing remarks. I need to get moving before the Gray Lady gang rushes in here for their weekly gossip session, which, for the record, is way scarier than the reincarnation of the Lord and Savior. Every Sunday, the posse of 80 to 100-year-old ladies shows up in matching skirt suits and refined wigs, ready to talk shit and bully folks in the name of Christ. The whole congregation knows that they kick anyone out who dares use the bathroom during their regularly scheduled meeting with a swat of a cane and a glare so rigid that their victim is liable to cross over right here in the bathroom. Did you see what she had the nerve to wear today, Eveline? She's a 2-bit hussy, if you ask me, stuffed into that getup like a breakfast sausage. Their raspy voices rush under the bathroom door with the breeze from the fans in the hallway. I'm too late. Currently, the talk of the town is Miss Clarice, a woman in her 60s who owns a clothing boutique that specializes in form-fitting, outlandish attire best reserved for 90s Lil' Kim videos. She's back on the prowl for love after her fling with Pastor Davis ended abruptly a few weeks ago. The Grays threatened to circulate a petition for his retirement, deeming it inappropriate for a community leader to be seen with her in public. Miss Clarice isn't exactly helping her case, showing up to church every Sunday in outfits so tight it's a miracle she doesn't pop right out of them. Their murmurs move closer, so eager to dive into the juicy updates that they can't even wait to get inside the room. The pounding of their thick heels against the floor counts down to our impending face-off. I have to save myself. I burst through the door just before they arrive and walk past them without making eye contact as I rush to the stairs. grunts the oldest and roughest GLG member, Miss Eveline. Her straight chin-length black wig sways ever so slightly under a wide-brimmed lavender hat adorned with netting and an embroidered silver rose. They can't be satisfied taking our houses now that these white folks got to come up in here and take our churches too. Aretha, a light-skinned woman who's the tallest and sprightliest of the bunch, asks. Miss Eveline smacks Aretha's hand with a guttural shh. That there's Nevaeh, Pastor Pear's granddaughter, Miss Eveline says. The Jewish one, I hear, before the bathroom door closes behind them with a sharp click.
Thank you. So one of the things that really strikes me about that scene, which is, as you said, sort of the second scene of the book, and the first scene as well, where Nevaeh's mom is mistaken as her nanny, is that you start the novel really with these experiences of being misidentified and feeling out of place. Why did you start with that, and how does that sort of set the stage for the action of the novel?
So I wanted to have those two opposing experiences to really show how no matter which environment she's in, she's never enough, or she's never perceived as a member of that community. So it was important to me to have that sort of go back to back, because that's really what it feels like when you are multiracial, multi-ethnic, and you're a part of these different cultures and communities, and you're expected to fit in the way that you're supposed to visually fit in. And if you don't, then you feel really like you can't be a part of the community, especially when you're young. And so it was important to me, as you know, this is a novel about a young person. She's 15 going on 16, to show how long this has already been, how frequently this has been going on, because in the prologue, I believe she's 4 or 5, which is true to my experience. That literally happened to me as a 4-year-old. People had been mistaking my mom as my nanny for so long that eventually I turned to her and I said, Mommy, are you really my mommy? Because I didn't understand why that kept being asked or just assumed. And so to sort of really get into Nevaeh's character and her voice, I wanted to show how often and how common these sort of microaggressions really chip away at you. And even as someone who's so young at 15 years old, that's a long time to already having been experienced that type of racism and microaggressions.
Right, you can tell from the way she is kind of preparing herself in that scene that she's expecting this to happen. Like this is such a usual occurrence that she knows that she's going to be mistaken for somebody that she's not, or misunderstood. And that theme sort of runs so much throughout the novel, but there's so many other pieces that you talk about here. I mean, the book is really like chock full of challenges and dilemmas, right? There's divorce, there's infidelity, there's sexual assault, there's police brutality, there's cyberbullying, there's a bat mitzvah, and there's colorism. There's so many other things that are going on, which in some ways, you know, that's life, and particularly the life for a teen, I think, is you get that sense of it being very, very full. But how did you build the narrative? Sort of how did you, what was most important for you to highlight as you were thinking of the coming of age story? How did you weave all of these themes and pieces together?
Yeah, so, you know, it is a novel, it is a fiction story, but it is inspired by my life and my experiences. And so I wanted to sort of, I didn't want to shy away from any of those topics that you just mentioned, because the majority of them were true to my life. And so obviously with exaggerations and with certain things added in just to make it a good book. But it was like, I couldn't just talk about biracial, multiracial identity from my own perspective without also talking about white presenting privilege. I couldn't talk about how it feels to be Jewish and like secular, not practicing religious Jewish, and how that impacts my relationship to the community, in addition to some of the racism that does exist in white Jewish communities, and how that impacted me as a multiracial Jewish person, and how I felt pushed away from the community as a result of that. Those are things that are inherent to my experience, and I think are common in a lot of people's experiences, even if they may not have my exact identity. They may only resonate with one of those things, but either way, they all felt like topics that I rarely see discussed, especially in young people's literature, and also just young people's media in general, television, film as well. And as you said, young people, everything is going on for young people. When you're in high school, it's like you're really becoming an adult person, even if you're a young adult. And so you're grappling with everything, right? You're grappling with starting to realize that your parents are not these like superheroes. They're flawed humans, and you're falling in love and figuring out who you are and who you love. You're figuring out what friendships really are, because I feel like up till a certain point, friendships are really just surface level. And once you really start having other more nuanced and in depth, you have more like deeper relationships with people, that changes the way that you interact with other people. And I really think right now, especially, young people are leading the charge in terms of making sure that conversations are being had around formerly taboo topics about race, about identity, about police brutality, about anti-Semitism. And I felt like I owed it to them to be real on the page about it too, because they deserve to see that represented, the work they're doing and the effort they're putting in to making sure this world becomes more equitable and safe for everybody. That deserves to be on the page too. So that was my motivation. And it took a while. It took a while for me. There was a lot of fear in being so blunt about some of the issues I was talking about, because it's going to make people uncomfortable and not everyone's going to be happy with it. But I wouldn't have felt like I told the authentic story I was trying to tell if I shied away from those things.
Mm-hmm. And that comes through in your characters too, because I think one of the things that marks them is that or many of them, not all of them, but they really, they speak difficult truths to one another. And that's really an important piece of sort of how the plot is furthered. One of the questions that's already come up in the chat, which I think relates to this, is sort of your decision to write this as a novel as opposed to a memoir. And then the second question I want to ask after that is your decision to write it as a young adult novel, in that category, and sort of what that means.
Yeah, so I would say the biggest struggle I had writing the book was reminding myself. So the truth is, like, my life, I think it's interesting in the sense that my heritage is unique, especially considering how I look, and being as white presenting as I am. I am also, like, my mother is a first generation American. There's a lot of pieces to my experience that are unique. However, my life was not that exciting or interesting. And so as I was trying to piece this story together, because as I said, it was something I had always wanted to do and I hadn't figured out how, I really tried to stick to my life and really tell my life story. And what I found was that it was quite boring. And, an interesting idea does not a good book make. And so the thing I had to keep reminding myself as I was writing it was that it was okay to really tap into my imagination and turn it into a novel and make it as interesting as possible, because otherwise it would not be a good book. And so that was the reason why I didn't write a memoir, is because a memoir from me would not get published. So
Well, I'm sure your life is more interesting to people other than yourself, but
possibly, yeah. So, and the reason I wrote it as a young adult book, truthfully, was what I was saying before, is I had never seen this in that space, and you know, as I said in the very beginning, I really could have used this book. And the fact of the matter is, I'm getting emails from young people still today saying, I've never seen myself in a book until now. And so that shows me that now, you know, I'm in my 30s. That means there not much progress has been made, and this was something that needed to be done. And so I wanted to offer this to young people, but I didn't just because it's written for young people doesn't mean I dumbed it down. The language I used, for the most part, I felt like it could speak to an adult. And I've actually received some emails from adults who sort of said what I said, of like, I wish I'd had this as a young person, but I appreciate it now still. Like, it still resonates and gives me that validation in my experience. And so it didn't feel limiting to write it for young people. In fact, I almost primarily mostly read young adult books. I find them to be, there's such a wide range of young adult literature, and some of the best writers in the game are doing young adult right now. I also think that if you're going to be writing in a space, you should be reading in that space, because things are constantly shifting. But yeah, so I was really excited to be entering the space, just because young people, again, like, young people are really leading the charge in a lot of ways of what's going on. And I wanted to be able to be a part of that in some way.
Yeah, that's a really compelling argument. I love young adult literature also. And often think that, sort of like, I don't understand why people often think of young adult as somehow being, simpler or something. Like, last week our quarantine book talk was with Lizzie Skurnick, talking about not a young adult book, but she has an imprint of republishing young adult literature. So we were actually talking about some of those books that influenced us. Are there particular, I know you were saying that you didn't find books as you were growing up that reflected your own experience, but were there particular writers that influenced you as you were coming of age that you sort of had in mind in some way?
Honestly, not that influenced me. I had books that I loved and returned to. Like, I read the original Pinocchio and the original Wizard of Oz books every year until college. I was a huge Harry Potter fan. I loved one of the books where I almost felt like I saw myself, but it was a very different type of book. It's a memoir by James McBride called Color of Water.
Oh yeah, that's a great book.
It's fabulous. I remember rereading that often. Maybe, if anything, that's the closest to one that I found for inspiration. But yeah, there just weren't a ton. And so I would really just read for enjoyment rather than connection.
So one of the kind of devices of the book is that Nevaeh finds her mother's journal from when she was a teen and uses it to kind of learn more about her mother and connect to her mother as an adult, but also, think about her own experience of coming of age. And that journal tells the story of a sexual assault and about the beginning of her relationship with her father. How did you decide to put that kind of story within the story?
So the reason that I had that side story was because at the time, the Me Too movement was really taking storm, and my mother was a part of that movement. She came forward with a sexual assault that occurred to her by a public figure, and it was one of those moments where I had known about it, but to see the scrutiny and the negative response she received she had a lot of support as well, but there was a lot of harassment, and it opened my eyes to just the way that when you're a child in a parent-child relationship, you put a lot of pressure on your parents to be perfect. You expect them to be perfect and to always be there for you and to not make mistakes. And that's not always fair, right? They're people too, and people are flawed. They've also been through life before you came, and as you are around, things are occurring and happening to them. And it just opened my eyes to that, and that sort of way that I had never given my mom the benefit of the doubt. And I wanted to talk about that through this young person's voice as a way for perhaps a young person to not come to that realization in their 30s, which isn't to say that parents don't deserve to be held accountable and can't make horrific mistakes that cannot be forgiven or anything like that, but just to remember that your parents are people. So that was and that specific situation was, again, just informed from my life. It was what my mom experienced was very different than what her mother experienced, but it was just the idea.
Yeah, it's an interesting piece around, sort of when people can come to realize their parents as people and recognize that they're going through their own things, which they might not know about. One of my favorite characters in the book is Rabbi Sarah, and I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how you constructed that character and why it was important to you to have a rabbi and a female rabbi in the story.
Yeah, so Rabbi Sarah's one of my favorite characters too, if not my favorite. She was loosely based off the rabbi that I worked with for my bat mitzvah, who was a female rabbi. She was not converted. She was very kind to me. My bat mitzvah was not nearly as exciting or fun or interesting as this bat mitzvah, but I didn't have a choice about whether I was going to have my bat mitzvah. My being raised practicing Judaism was something that was actually written into my parents' divorce papers, and it was something I struggled with, in that I just didn't feel connected religiously. I'd also never felt welcome by the community, and she was very kind to me, despite the fact that I was pretty bratty and not super engaged. The reason I chose for her to be converted into Judaism was I actually met with multiple times a female rabbi who had converted to Judaism herself. And there was a connection that I found between her experience and the experience that I had as a multiracial person, where she had moments within the Jewish community where she had felt like she was always a little bit an outsider because she had converted. And that was something, just that feeling was something that Nevaeh experiences in both of her communities. And it was something that they connected on, and eventually allows her to open herself up to Judaism, because there's this person who's saying, look, I get what you're feeling, but you're allowed to take this community, this religion, and this culture and make it yours in the way in the way your heart wants to. And it's something that honestly I wish I had as kind as the rabbi I worked with was. That wasn't what our relationship was, and I'm sure a big part of that was myself, and also she was busy, but so it was sort of my way of reimagining how that time in my life and my relationship to the Jewish community could have been.
I also loved that Rabbi Sarah sort of functions as this figure who shows how showing your vulnerability can be a source of strength and can actually be like a leadership tool. Like that's what makes it possible for Nevaeh to really connect with her, is that she sees, she kind of sees where Rabbi Sarah struggles, and that opens up the possibility for them to connect. And I love that you sort of at the end have her describe her as a superhero, which she doesn't necessarily come across as in the beginning. I mean, it starts out a little bit more rocky. The book also, like, to talk about the kind of some of the scenes around the bat mitzvah. I think one of the really powerful things that the book shows is how multiracial identity can be really, really hard, but also can be this incredible source of strength and insight. And in fact, what reminded me to ask this question now was referencing how Sarah is called the superhero at the end, but Nevaeh in her bat mitzvah talks about her identity, her multiracial identity, as a kind of superpower, like coming to realize that it's not something to feel bad about, but it's something that gives her a lot of strength. Can you tell us a little bit what you meant by seeing that as Nevaeh's superpower?
Yeah, so as was sort of referenced in that chapter I read, and also in the prologue, when we first met Nevaeh, she feels invisible. She feels like because she doesn't look Black and because she's not practicing Judaism and she's half Black, and that also makes her feel like there's tension, or she's been made to feel like that keeps her sort of from being a part of the Jewish community. She feels invisible, and she feels that she doesn't have a right to be either or both. And as she comes into herself, as she goes through this process of coming of age and finding herself and her communities, she realizes how much power her voice has and how much power she has as a member of her family, and how much power her family members have, and that how that sort of she's starting to not shy away from it, but to want to soak it in. And so, you know, what the bat mitzvah is for her as a coming of age ceremony that she's having at 16 instead of 13, and you know, it's not a traditional bat mitzvah in any way, really. It's really her way of saying, I'm here, I'm both of these, I'm part of both of these worlds, and I'm going to do everything I can to not just use that for good, but to also give back to those communities. And I think that's a really powerful thing. And when you have those moments, because even still today, I have so many insecurities about my placement in both communities. But when you have moments where you realize, wow, like I am a part of this, and the history of these people and my family are so powerful and so amazing, it gives you a lot of pride. And I wanted her to have that, because, you know, her life, as well as mine, as well as a lot of people who are multiracial, multi-ethnic, you have the constant nagging feeling of not belonging. And that it hurts, it tears you up. And so I wanted her to have that really, and have this opportunity to say it out loud on a stage that felt really meaningful.
Yeah, it feels like such an important way that she's able to both articulate that strength and then also talk about like her privilege and the ways in which she realized, you know, I feel like one of the interesting things about Nevaeh is how she's struggling to not be invisible and also not take up too much space at the same time, right? Like she's trying to find the right balance there. And she's trying to better understand her privilege as a light-skinned person and her privilege as somebody who, you know, goes to private school and has had a certain amount of class privilege. And as I was reading this, I couldn't help but, or rereading it actually, because I'd read it earlier in the year, I couldn't help but think about some of the debates that have been happening in recent weeks on social media about Jewish privilege. What do you make of that, you know, that whole kind of cultural brouhaha, and why is this such a fraught topic, talking about privilege and white privilege and Jewish privilege and all those things?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's uncomfortable no matter what to really acknowledge your privileges, because when you're doing that, you're not just acknowledging what you have, you're recognizing how that impacts the people who don't have that. And especially if you're from a marginalized community, it's hard to not want to remind people like, okay, sure, but, you know, and that's tricky. And it's tricky too, because there's validity to that, right? It's not fair to erase the hardships that a specific community has gone through. However, in America specifically, when it comes to the Black community, and any marginalized community, it's not useful to try to balance out the hardships or the oppression that the community has had. It's about sort of taking a step back and recognizing that acknowledging those privileges is not to take away from the hardships that you've had. It's recognizing that you haven't had the hardships that this other group of people have had. And specifically in America, the Black community and it has and is continuing to experience a deep-rooted systemic prejudice that is different than the hardships and oppression and violence that has occurred to the Jewish community. And so I think, to be honest, I haven't been super engaged with anything because I have a 9-month-old and I'm also working full time. And so it's hard for me to stay on top of things and eat and shower but
and sometimes it's best for our mental health not to weigh in on Twitter.
Absolutely. But yeah, in terms of just privilege and recognizing that, to me, that's the most, I think it's a really healthy exercise to get uncomfortable and constantly check in with yourself about your privileges, especially when, perhaps it's something, or maybe perhaps it's a topic or a community that you have not really engaged with. And so it may bring up awareness of privileges that you were not tuned into. And that can also be uncomfortable because you want to feel like you know yourself and that you're aware and that you're, doing your best to be good. And there's nothing, you're not good if you're not realizing these things. You're only doing harm if you actively choose to be complacent about those things. And the difference, that to me is the big difference. And so it's just about internal work and just not being afraid to be uncomfortable.
Yeah. I think also there's something about the word privilege, like the definition of privilege is something that's unearned, right? Like a benefit that you get that is unearned. But I think part of the dynamic of that is that someone who has privilege is like, well, I didn't ask for this necessarily.
Totally.
Like, I feel, I didn't do anything to, like, don't blame me, sort of, right? And it's sort of being able to separate that sense of responsibility for having it from the sense of responsibility for like what that then does in the world, and taking responsibility for how it shows up and how you show up in that way. Which I think that piece that you said about, being uncomfortable and being okay with that, not shying away from that is really, really important, What would you say white Jews should be doing now for racial justice? I mean, I think that it's a very big question, obviously. Yeah. But, how do you think about where, having talked about some of the ways in which your own experience was uncomfortable in the Jewish community, mm-hmm. What do you think are the things that need to change most?
I think first, just the overall acknowledgement that Jews of color exist is very important, and an active support of making sure that those people and their voices and their stories are given a platform and recognized as Jewish stories and voices and people. I also think calling out any racism within the white Jewish community is important, and it's tricky. I'm not so good at keeping track of the chat, but I did earlier see someone had made a comment. They seemed to not be happy with the father or the grandmother character, saying that they were extremely negative characters. Obviously, everyone has the right to interpret characters however they want. I don't think of either of them as completely negative characters, especially not rooted in their Judaism. Her father is a narcissist and has a lot of issues that are not related to his Judaism. Her grandmother is a product of her generation, and it was important to me that without giving too much away, she opens herself up to change. And part of the reason that happens is because there's a moment in the book where Nevaeh sort of stands up and says, like, you have to love all of me. Like, I am also this. Like, I am Jewish, but I am also Black. And you have to love all of me. And that's a thing that's a really hard thing to do in your family. It's hard. Something that happens, and this isn't just in the Jewish community, this is just in multiracial, biracial families, often, or not, I shouldn't say often, it is common for a family member, whether they are white or just another race from a Black race, for anti-Blackness, because it is so deeply seeped into this country and everyone in it. You can feel racism from within your family at your dinner table. And it is really hard. It's really hard to call people out on this no matter what. It is impossibly hard to do it with someone you love, with someone who you want to love you. It is hard to tell someone that they've been making you feel bad, especially because that's the big thing about Bubby is Bubby, I don't think, in my head when I was writing it, Bubby doesn't think anything she's saying or doing is hurtful. And it is. And there's also a moment where Nevaeh sort of knows a prayer, and she feels her grandmother's love, and it makes her feel so good. And it's something that she's desperately wanted. And so I think it's really just about making sure that the conversations at home are inclusive and are open to criticism, and not to be defensive, to perhaps just take in what's being said around you. And, you know, you're allowed to disagree, but listening sometimes can be the most powerful tool, which is a lesson that Nevaeh learns. Sometimes, like, using your voice is so important, but it's almost more important to listen. And so I think just in general with I've been feeling like, up until very recently, a lot of the world has been looking out their window, and their windows have been frosted. And suddenly there's been a crack in that window, and they're seeing clearly for the first time certain things. And that's really overwhelming, I think, to realize how unaware you've been to things, even if it's things that family members or friends have been talking to you about, but you haven't been able to hear it. Seeing that for the first time and really trying to digest that is a lot. And listening and just taking it all in, and then starting to take stock of that and noticing it more, and being vocal when it's useful, being silent when it's useful, being okay with walking away from organizations or people or groups that are perpetuating these issues. I think that's the best thing anyone in any community can be doing.
Yeah, I think about this a lot. I mean, I think about this a lot in terms of gender. Like, I notice so much when certain people who have, grown up with male privilege feel like they are often allowed to speak, or that it's their place to speak and step up. And that's how they process things, is because they're always used to being the ones who are turned to open their mouths and explain things. And as a woman, I often find that very irksome, but also recognizing that happens in so many dynamics. And I think about it for myself as a white person, like, I'm comfortable speaking and thinking about, well, if you're someone who thinks of yourself as someone who likes to weigh in or has things to say, like, how do you make space for other people? How do you step back and make room and have that be sort of like your internal check to be like, do I need to speak now? Am I the person who needs to speak now? Or do I pull back and make space for somebody else to speak? She says, as the moderator of the weekly program. I was also wondering this in terms of, as you were talking about the different dynamics of race, and so many of these things are so culturally specific. So like the United States has a very particular dynamic around Blackness and whiteness that's different, like in Brazil, for example. So I'm wondering, like, as someone whose heritage is Liberian and Brazilian, like, how did those dynamics play out in terms of your understanding of race as an American, or your experience of it?
Yeah, so it was really interesting because both my grandparents were immigrants. My mother and her siblings are all first generation Americans. They didn't grow up in America for the first 15 years of my mom is the oldest, so I'll go by her. Like the first 15 years of her life, my grandfather was actually the ambassador of Liberia, and so they were living all over Europe and in Cameroon. And they moved to America when the Civil War broke out in Liberia, and he actually had to get refugee status here. And so then they came to America, and my mom. So when my parents married, it was before the anti-miscegenation laws had happened. So it was illegal. Their union was not legal here. My mom was not a legal, like her birth was illegal in America, and my grandmother remembers, so my grandmother was Brazilian, but she was pretty light skinned. My grandfather was a Black man, and he was pretty dark skinned. And they told this story about how he was driving her. They were somewhere in the South, and he made her lay down in the car because he was like, this looks like a Black man driving a white woman, and that will not go over well. And so there were experiences like that. It was also just being biracial at that time was not, it was weird. Like my mom and her siblings were often made to feel like they didn't belong in either place. And so having grown up in that sort of, grown up all over the world, and then to come to America, I think it was a lot, and it's sort of hard to find your place if you're not in one place for a long period of time. And those are really formative years when you're, becoming a young adult. And so I think it was tricky. It was also, my mom and her siblings all look also very different. So my mom is the lightest skin. She gets mistaken for any race. One time she and I went to a play that was primarily Indian characters, and we were waiting in the lobby for one of her friends who was the performer, and someone ran up, grabbed my mom, and thanked her for her performance. And we were like, what's going on? And so so I feel like I've gone a little bit off topic, but it's, I grew up in a family where everybody looks different. Everyone sounds different. My grandmother had an extremely thick Brazilian accent, and she lived here for 50 years and spoke English, but she always threw Portuguese words into her sentences. I grew up eating West African food as a baby. I had to go to both temple and church on the weekends. My grandfather was a Baptist pastor. I also had to go to temple. And so I grew up with, in a world, and I also grew up in New York City. And I think that's important too, because it wasn't weird. My upbringing, it wasn't super unique. A lot of my friends had interracial parents, had biracial families. Maybe not all of them were also immigrants, but it didn't seem odd or unique necessarily at the time. And as I got older and lived in different places, went to college, I realized like, oh, I lived in a bubble, and I was really privileged in that way. And so, yeah, so I think a lot of just my, a lot of the way I think was informed by this way that I was raised. And so breaking out of that bubble it's still something I sometimes struggle with. It's why I haven't strayed far from New York City.
Can understand that.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear a little bit about the reception of your book in the Jewish community. I know that there was a recent controversy where your book was left off of a list of books by Jews of color that was meant to be putting together a list to kind of promote voices, but at the same time was, kind of sort of policing the boundaries of what can be said and what can't be said.
Yeah. So I just think, as I said before, I think that it's really important for Jews of color to be given a platform, to be given support from the just overall Jewish community, and to make it clear that no experience is singular, right? No Jewish experience is singular. No Black experience is singular, no Black Jewish experience is singular. I think there are many experiences that are all going to offer different insight, are going to touch on different aspects of the community. And it is important for that to be recognized and acknowledged as part of the overall Jewish experience. And so, yeah, so, you know, as was mentioned earlier, there are some people who aren't happy with some of the Jewish characters in this book. Everyone obviously has a right to their opinion, to how they interpret things. I think it's important to remember, though, that what I was doing or hoping to do was to shine a light on some of the experiences I have had where I have been made to feel unwelcome, in the hopes that that will change. And I'm seeing a lot of people are saying, what about you know, Black people who are anti-Semitic? That's also unacceptable. That's, you know, not what I was writing about. That isn't something in my families that I have experienced. So that wasn't something I was touching upon. That doesn't invalidate it or mean that it doesn't happen. It just wasn't part of my story.
Right. There are a lot of questions about your family's reception of the book too. Like, how did your parents feel about this book? And, you know, sort of, did they see themselves in it?
Yeah,
how are you sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, they loved it. They're really supportive. You know, I haven't had an easy relationship to my father, and it's gotten really wonderful. He's a great grandfather to my daughter, and he is a poet and is really proud of his daughter for becoming a published author, and is really supportive of this. And, you know, it is, again, fiction. So there, you know, it is not exactly what happened, but there are aspects of it that are true. There's an author's note at the end of the book that really delves into my story. So you can sort of see what is real and what I made up.
And how are you thinking about your own daughter and how you will raise her with a, you know, complex sense of her own identity?
Yeah, so I mean, my daughter is, she is Black and Jewish and Puerto Rican and Irish. There's a lot, and Brazilian. There is a lot to her, and I am hoping to do my best to introduce her to every aspect of her identity, and allow her the space to find her place in those communities, and how she best wants to sort of take ownership of that, and also, you know, perhaps not engage. I'm open to her being religious or not. I am personally just not a religious person. I do feel very connected to the Jewish community. Recently, I started feeling that way more. Not necessarily the religion, but I don't feel connected to the Baptist community either in that way, although I love going to Baptist churches. I love the music, but I'm just not religious. And so that's something that has been hard for me, to be a secular Jewish person, but we exist. And just because we don't practice the religion doesn't mean we're not valid.
Right. And I think that's one of the pieces that you grapple with in the book too, is sort of for Nevaeh to try to figure out what it's going to be like for, you know, what a Jewish identity will mean for her, and what her bat mitzvah will mean, and, you know, all of those kinds of pieces. Mm-hmm. As a writer, what has it been like to be writing during this pandemic? Are you writing now? It's been an interesting question we've been talking about with a lot of the authors we have on. A lot of people aren't able to write at all. Some people are writing things that are specific to this moment.
Yeah, I mean, I am struggling to get anything down on the page. I do my best when I can, but at the end of the day, I am pretty drained and want to get to sleep because I have to be up very early in the morning. I am missing writing desperately. It's truly my favorite thing to do, even though probably the only thing I do on Twitter is complain about it. But it really, like, when I'm flowing and I'm writing, I don't know how to explain it. It feels so nice. Like it feels like my purpose in some ways. And I'm really missing that. And I'm struggling with that. And I'm especially struggling with it because the reason I'm not writing is because I have my daughter and I love her. She's amazing. But it's taken this thing away from me right now in this wild situation we're in, where I feel like I would be getting a lot of writing done. So that's hard, but I'm just trying to remind myself how grateful I am to have this time with her. And I found a childcare situation that I'm so privileged to have the opportunity to have, but I wouldn't have this time with her. And so I'm really grateful for that.
Yeah, I very much relate to that. And I have heard that from so many parents who are feeling at once sort of crazed and exhausted and recognizing that this is an unusual experience.
It is very odd.
And parenting is a creative endeavor. It takes a lot of creative energy, I think, but it does come back. Yeah, I can assure you.
Yeah.
Having children who are older than 9 months old. But I also think that so many people are having trouble writing in this moment.
Yeah.
And it's really hard. It's hard to know how to process this time. And you can't, some people process through writing, and I usually am that kind of person, but it's been hard for me too.
Yeah. Yeah. It's tough. And I mean, who knows? It's also like the grass is always greener, right? Like I could be on the other side and not be getting any work done because I'm having massive writer block because I have anxiety because every time I sneeze, I think I'm going to die. Right. So there's also that.
Yes. Yeah, well, I have loved talking to you about this book. I'm trying to think if there are other questions that I missed that I think we need to talk about.
Oh yeah, let's see.
There's a lot of questions about your own family and your daughter and but we've talked a little bit about that, about sort of how you want to raise her. But it's always interesting to see the kinds of questions that people ask and how much people want to know about people's own story. And, I think that's one question I have is, do you think that when you are writing again, you will continue to explore some of these same kinds of issues? Like, do you feel like you've kind of like worked through some of this stuff and are on to other things? Or do you feel like there's more to this that you want to dig into for yourself?
No, I mean, so I don't know if I will ever write something so personal. This was a really, it's the book of my heart. It really is. And, I'm so proud of it. And that's something that, like, in the process of it, I hated doing it because it was really painful to dredge up a lot of these feelings and experiences, and to even have having to like remind myself of my privileges and like really dig deep into them. Those things, it's a tough thing to do, as we were talking about before, but I'm really proud of it and I'm really happy with it. And I'm glad that I got it out. And so I don't know if I'm ever going to put myself through that again. Mm-hmm. That being said, it is really important to me to write characters that I feel I can do justice to their voice. And so it is always important to me that my characters will be biracial, multiracial, and Jewish. That's important to me. I want to keep writing those stories because we don't see enough of them. And this is one story. I have other experiences that I can speak to and can be translated into other completely different worlds and stories that I'm hoping to be able to write.
Thank you. Yes. Well, Beth is suggesting that you should write about Rabbi Sarah and continue her story, because there's a lot there. That could be a spinoff.
Oh yeah. I mean, that I would love that.
But I think that is a really interesting question about, or not question, but point that often people, kind of think like, okay, well, now I've read about the X experience. And of course, when we look at literature, like that's the whole point of literature, that
right.
There is every experience is its own experience. And we can't
absolutely
talk about, kind of one book capturing it. One of the things what I was also wondering is, as you, I think, referenced before, there's a lot of poetry that you've woven into the book. And I think that it's a really beautiful way of giving us some insight into some of the things that Nevaeh has trouble articulating. And I wonder, you said you had written some of that poetry before. Sort of, do you write poetry on, as another piece of your work? And can you imagine publishing that as its own book?
Well, so I've always written poetry. I was an only child, and because I didn't have someone else my age at home, my parents separated and divorced when I was really young. And when you're a kid, you don't always open up to your parents about certain things. And so I always used poetry as my way of working through my own emotions. I don't know if I would ever feel comfortable doing an actual poetry book. That seems really scary to me. But I am right now dabbling in trying to write something in verse.
Oh, nice.
Which is difficult but fun. But again, like when I say working on, I mean mostly theoretically in my brain when I'm doing dishes.
Well, we look forward to when that comes out of your brain and ends up somewhere where more of us can read it. Yeah. Thank you so much, Natasha, for being with us tonight. Thank you to all of you in the audience who have joined us for this conversation. I hope that you'll be back with us here next week, same time, same place, Thursday at 8 Eastern time, for a conversation with Dr. Javi Karkowski. This will be about a nonfiction book. Javi is a maternal fetal medicine specialist, and she wrote a book called High Risk: Stories of Pregnancy, Birth, and the Unexpected. We'll also be talking about women's health during a pandemic and race and maternal medicine. For those of you who are new to JWA, I hope you will check out the many, many, many resources we have in our digital archive at jwa.org, from lesson plans to online exhibits to primary sources to a podcast and a multi-generational blog. There are so many different voices and perspectives to find there. And until next time, wishing everybody good health, safety, be well, and good night. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. This was fabulous.
Yeah, thanks.